Alright, so a little over 2 years ago, I made the decision to quit being a freelancer and start to build an agency, and the transition has been difficult. At the time, I was doing UI UX design and Webflow development for a range of different clients, typically startups, maybe based in the US or in the UK, and things were going pretty well. I was making roughly about 10K a month. Some months with kind of freelancing, it's gonna dip down a little bit, and other months it's gonna be much higher, especially if you have kind of stacked invoices. But with the steady base of retainers and new projects coming through referrals, things were going very well and it was very comfortable. And when you're a freelancer with a consistent business, it's an incredible thing because you don't actually have a boss technically, even though you do kind of work with clients, but you do have complete freedom and you have a lack of overheads. And honestly, it's a great life. But at that point, I made a decision to quit being a freelancer and start to build an agency out of that freelance foundation that I'd built. And now I have a much bigger team, more responsibilities, I probably work more, and I also earn less than I did when I was a freelancer. But what I wanted to do in this video was run through the 3 things that made me make the decision to go from freelancer to building an agency, and reflect on whether I actually think that that was the right move to make 2 years ago. And if someone's in a similar situation, what the best path ahead is right now. So the first reason, and to be honest, one of the things I really struggled with as a freelancer, was my absolute obsession over the details. And as a freelancer, I always obsessed over those details, and still now I do the same thing. But the difference is in the way that it's framed. So when I was a freelancer, one of my biggest issues was that because I was doing web design, so UI UX design, and development, and then obviously delivering a kind of service to clients, but then you also have like the whole business side of things, it always felt like I just didn't have enough time. Even if I didn't work with a lot of clients, I really like to do things the right way. So even if it's like the tiniest little details in the design, or it's the tiniest little details of how I was building a website inside a Webflow, or even just building my own company, I always want to do it right. I always want to kind of add that little bit of extra flair, that little bit of extra polish. And that is really hard to do when you have multiple things that you're offering as that service provider, as that freelancer. So I kind of got into a little bit of a trap, and honestly, I think it's probably one of the biggest issues with the whole kind of web design space. I think maybe if you're a different service provider, maybe if it's like one very kind of defined area, this might not be such a big issue because you can really focus on mastering that one thing. But when it was design and development, I always felt that for every minute that I'd spend on design, it was a minute I wasn't spending on development. And every minute I'd spend on development, it was a minute I wasn't spending on design. So sure, I could get pretty damn good at both together, but I could never be great at both of them because there just was not enough time in the day to become great at both of them. And because of this, it always felt like I was just kind of spinning my wheels. It always felt like there was something that I should be doing slightly different to what I was actually doing in that moment. So when I was thinking about potentially working with other people, I think often the apprehension when you're trying to build an agency or you're hiring other people to work with you is that the quality of work is going to go down. And I knew that that was a risk, but I also knew that if set up correctly, there was a much higher chance that if you had someone who was completely obsessed with design, and then someone who was completely obsessed with development, and then someone who was completely obsessed with the whole client experience and making sure that kind of working with your team was a 5-star experience, that would be way better than one person who just does not have the time, the attention, the bandwidth to do all of those things. So later in the journey of being a freelancer, and at that point it must have been about 4 or 5 years I'd been a freelancer, it very much felt like I'd hit a ceiling. And that paired with the final point that I'll touch on in a second, which is building products, was also at a point where I felt like I needed to make a decision between being an entrepreneur or a freelancer. And this is something that was made really prevalent by an article from Seth Godin that just kind of sticks in my head. And in the article, he talks a lot about the idea of either being a freelancer or being an entrepreneur. And you need to decide which one you are, because a freelancer is someone who does essentially have a job. They are paid to do the work. But an entrepreneur, someone who builds a business, essentially they're paid to run the company that does the work, or at least own the company that does the work, not be the individual who is doing the work. And for me, a huge part of getting into this whole journey of kind of freelancing and building a business wasn't necessarily from the point of view of, hey, I'd really like to do this thing that I already knew, but do it freelance instead of working a job. My whole thing was, I was 17, 18, and I just really did not want to go to university and did not want to follow the traditional path of get a job and rise up the ranks. I just wanted the freedom and the options to kind of do things that I wanted to do. And I kind of fell into design and development and then figuring out freelancing as a mechanism, as a way to get that freedom. So one of the biggest things I always found when I was freelancing was that realistically, freelancing was just a phase. It was just, for me, something where I felt there's always something a little bit more because I want to continue building things. And I really like the pursuit of how do you have a bunch of different projects that you're working on. And I think that only really can be sustainable over a long period of time as an entrepreneur, because you do need other people. I guess that kind of just leads me naturally onto the final thing that really hit home and kind of solidified the decision here. And that is that I want to build products and I want to make content and I want to do a bunch of other things. And as a freelancer, you have plenty of time to do this stuff, but you don't really have the leverage to do it. A lot of your time is spent doing client work. A lot of your time is spent being the creative and kind of being in it all the time. And sure, there's a lot of people who maybe have built solo businesses. Maybe they freelance to start with and then they started to build products and do all of that stuff. But I know that the way I work is that I would much rather have multiple people working on something and focused on something and essentially build that leverage through having a team and having a system that is working for you over a long period of time. What's really scary here is, especially when I was first kind of freelancing and looking at hiring other people, is I have no idea how to hire people. I had no idea how to lead people, especially at that time. Like, we're kind of 2 years into it now and I'm learning a lot of this stuff. And these are very useful skills, I think, to learn. But really, when I talk about building products or I talk about kind of this YouTube channel, for example, this is only possible because the machine of the business is able to really facilitate the ability to have a higher output. Because as an individual, if it's always just on you as that one person, it's so dependent on you performing incredibly well at all times and always being in it and grinding and always replying to people. And as I mentioned, because I just love details and that idea of how do you obsess over something, that is very, very difficult to get out of my head, which always meant that if I would try carve out time to record YouTube videos or I'd carve out time to try build a product, it would just get pushed to the side because the urgent thing was the freelancing. It was, hey, this thing is making me money, so I'm just gonna always go do that thing. It's kind of that all or nothing mentality that I mentioned as to being kind of completely obsessed with the details. Now, if someone was to ask me the question, do I regret the decision to go from freelance to building out this agency? On the face of it, it might seem like it was a bad decision because over this period of time, I've worked way more than I would have if I was a freelancer. I have earned less money than I would have if I was a freelancer. I've definitely had more stress than I would have if I was a freelancer. But the reason that I don't regret this at this moment is because it feels like we have a lot of momentum. There's a lot of things that are building and we're in a very strong position and there's a very strong team behind everything we're doing, which then just enables so much more. And sure, it's like a little bit of kind of short-term pain here, but I think that if you're in a similar position, the real way you would make this decision is understanding what it is that you want long-term. It's like, do you want to be someone who has a team of people and is working on a few different projects and you do like that pursuit of how do I just build things? If that's you, then it probably would make a lot of sense to start to build out a team. It doesn't necessarily have to be an agency, but whatever makes sense for you. But if instead you just want to optimize more for how do I live a chill life and how do I actually maximize other things in life, then it would make way more sense to either pursue being a freelancer or continue to be a freelancer if you already are one. So overall, I don't regret the decision at all because of the huge amount of options and opportunities that are currently in front of me and in front of the team. But at the same time, it's definitely not a path that I would recommend everyone makes, because there are a lot more things that you're exposed to. As we kind of mentioned with freelancing, there's a lot of positives and there's a lot of negatives. You're exposed to a lot of upside and you're also exposed to a lot of downside. But when you run an agency or when you build a business in general, it just heightens both sides. You need to deal with people and you need to manage people and kind of all those sides of things. It really just heightens the experience of freelancing. And I think that a lot of people would just prefer to be a freelancer. And I totally get that. I guess the main thing here is all about the priorities. And to be honest, it's just whatever works best for you as the individual.